Welcome to the Old Soul, New Soul Astrology Podcast with Robert Glasscock. I'm Thomas Miller, and we have a Discord group that continues this conversation. It's kind of all tied into the Fun Astrology Podcast that I do every day. Kristen Lawhead runs that Discord channel. If you'd like to find it, it's free to join. There's a link in the show notes. Also, it's just called the Fun Astrology Podcast Discord channel. And in there is an Old Soul, New Soul channel where this podcast conversation continues. Well, Kristen Lawhead, who runs that for us over there, keeps that conversation going extremely well, brought us a question.
Hi, Thomas and Robert. This is Kristen Lawhead calling in with a topic from the Discord channel. We were wondering about synodic cycles and the significance of them, and if there are any that you pay attention to more than others. Thank you so much for this wonderful podcast and everything you're doing for the astrology community.
All right, Robert, let's start at the beginning, because on questions like this, I always want to presume that nobody knows what we're talking about. So let's go all the way back to the beginning.
Synodic cycles. That's a great question from Kristen. It's also a fairly esoteric one. It's basically what you're looking at is, for example, the periods of these cycles. For example, how often does transiting Jupiter conjoin transiting Saturn? That's one. You can do this with any pair of planets. How often does, say, transiting Mars conjoin transiting Pluto? And the point of doing this is to go back and trace, usually, historic events and epochs that begin under these conjunctions of various pairs of planets, especially the outer ones. So it's not necessarily the synodic cycle, something that you're going to get into extensively in a natal chart. But here's one application of it. For instance, I think it is important, maybe on a secondary level. I don't know that you would do this necessarily in a first natal reading, because you could spend quite a bit of time thinking about this. But the conjunction of Jupiter and Saturn is an important conjunction. And if you go back in the tables, which you can find on Google, you can look to see what was the conjunction of Jupiter and Saturn before your birth. When was it, and what degree did it happen? And what house does that conjunction fall in your natal chart? Because that starts a whole new Jupiter-Saturn cycle. Jupiter moves faster than Saturn does. So I was born in 1944, Thomas, with Jupiter sextile my Saturn. So I know that my birth Jupiter-Saturn sextile is an opening sextile from the previous Jupiter-Saturn conjunction. So I go back in the tables and I see that 3 years before I was born, in 1941, Jupiter and Saturn were conjunct at 8 degrees Taurus, which is basically right on my 5th cusp. Well, I'm born 3 years after that, by which point Saturn has moved into Cancer, no longer in Taurus, and Jupiter has gone past Saturn, is now in Virgo. So they're now in an opening sextile in relationship to that original conjunction. But you look at where this prenatal Jupiter-Saturn conjunction occurred, because that starts for everybody a whole new Jupiter-Saturn synodic cycle, if you will, which is Kristen's question. Well, it's on my 5th cusp. It's in my 4th, but it's on my 5th, and it's in Taurus. That's my house of creativity, if you will. And that has been my entire career life, which is one of the major things that these Jupiter-Saturn synodic cycles shows, business. And I have Taurus, the money sign, on that cusp, my 5th house of creativity. So one of the primary ways you could say about this guy is that he can make money through his creativity. Absolutely true. All of my life. So it shows that this Jupiter-Saturn synodic cycle, for me, hit right on my 5th cusp. So it says, pay attention to this. And when I did choose to be born 3 years after that conjunction, they were now in an opening sextile relationship. So I am now meant to, in this life, take advantage of this harmonious aspect between Jupiter and Saturn as far as my creative earning a living is involved. And here you see it, Jupiter in Virgo in the 9th house of philosophy, psychology, nonfiction, astrology, higher thinking, higher consciousness, all of that. But it's in Virgo, a very practical and also a very skeptical sign. And I'm totally skeptical about pretty much everything. But I'm also experimentative. So I will try something and see, does it work? And of course, as I began to try astrology, I was pretty amazed that it did work. And of course, it's become my life. But it's all goes back to that original Jupiter-Saturn synodic cycle starting at 8 degrees Taurus, my creativity. And that's been my entire life. Went out there and went to Los Angeles to be an actor, got immediately into astrology and suddenly was making more money doing that than I was acting, wound up publishing for American Astrology Magazine for 10 years, 250,000 words a year. So I knew what that was, to write on deadlines and write a lot, and then got into television writing for about 15 years, the same thing, highly demanding, but all creativity. So that's a way that you can use these prenatal synodic cycles in a way to maybe enhance your understanding and your depth of understanding your natal chart. And you can do that with any pair of planets.
This is fascinating. This is great. Thank you for that answer. Kristen, thank you for the question. Let's take on a couple more that are mundane, that are macro here. And one that I'd like to point you to, but this is a really long cycle, but I think this is so significant for what is going on today. And that is the Saturn-Pluto conjunction that took place, and there's a chart in the notes that you can download, took place on January 12th, 2020. Where Saturn and Pluto conjoined in the sky for the first time since 1518 in the sign of Capricorn. And that Capricorn, obviously ruled by Saturn, is what is incredibly significant. And do you know that about 2.5 weeks after this aspect, we started a new word in our vocabulary called COVID, which was with us for the next at least 2 years and still is today. But as a worldwide debilitating pandemic, we all know what we've been through. So how do you frame up Saturn and Pluto?
You start with the basics. What does Capricorn rule? And this is for the world, the entire world.
Governments.
It rules governments. It rules
corporations, yeah.
And what does Saturn conjunct Pluto mean to you?
Massive transformation.
All right. It is massive transformation because of Pluto's association with Scorpio in the 8th house. It is also death and rebirth, and I mean literally as well as figuratively.
That was the nice way of saying transformation.
Well, and this is it. People don't understand. They glibly throw out that word transformation for Scorpio in the 8th house, but think about it. For something to be transformed, the old something has to die. And we don't die. Our souls don't die. We never die. Consciousness never dies. But our form does. And that's what this is. The form of governments around the world, the forms of government around the world are all dying and being reborn simultaneously as something else. Now, this terrifies people. Because all of the old paradigms of authorities, which is Capricorn, again, all of them, religious authorities, political philosophies like communism or democracy or fascism or socialism, all of them are dying slowly, partly because the world is now reaching about 8 billion people. We have climate change that is affecting everybody simultaneously around the world with these incredible weather events. We have the pandemic, which, if nothing else, was meant to show us you are all connected and all connected with nature and with every plant and animal. This virus came from animals to human beings, just like the AIDS virus did. But the pandemic hit everybody everywhere, no matter what color, what race, what political philosophy, what religion, what kind of government, everybody. It stopped shipping. It still stopped shipping. It's affected everything. You can't buy an American-made Ford because the parts for the American-made Ford come from 28 different countries, and they're assembled in Mexico. So everything that we do is interconnected now, and the pandemic was made to say, look, people, if you don't get past this tribalism, this nationalism, this separatism, this competition for power and property and money and land and power, you're going to die. The world will die. And one of the threats here is exactly what Putin is already making about using a nuclear weapon, for example. So what we're watching here under this Saturn-Pluto conjunction is the rebirth of governments around the world, and it's becoming ever more clear.
Well, let me show you this. We hadn't planned on this, so you're not prepared for this, but let me walk us back. Saturn and Pluto in Capricorn can only happen every 250 years. So let's hop back 2 cycles back to 1284. And notice that I have this set to Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. I didn't know where else to put it. There wasn't a Philadelphia, Pennsylvania in 1284, folks. But we do have Saturn and Pluto conjoining in Capricorn. And look at that stellium in there, Robert. This is incredible. All right, so what was the bridge here? This was the crossroads between the approximately 1,000 years of the Dark Ages on planet Earth. And then after, what happened in the 1300s was a famine, a war, a climate crisis, and a pandemic. You might remember it, the bubonic plague. And after the bubonic plague, something emerged in the little Italian town of Florence called the Renaissance. And the Italian Renaissance still is known by some historians as the greatest time to be alive on the planet. But we had to go through 1284 and through the 1300s to bridge the Dark Ages to the Italian Renaissance. And
Interesting, isn't it?
And that was kicked off by the Saturn-Pluto conjunction in Capricorn.
Very interesting.
Here's another one. This is the next time the two conjoined in Capricorn, because obviously it takes Pluto 250 years to go around, right? So from 1284 now to 1518, here they are again in Capricorn at 4 degrees. What happened here? Well, about 6 months before this aspect, a little rebel monk by the name of Martin Luther stuck an email on the door of the Catholic Church in Germany and said, "Dear Pope," which, by the way, in 1284, what was the cultural, political center of Europe?
Rome.
"Dear Rome, we don't like the way you're doing it." And this began the Protestant Reformation. And all of the power shifted from Rome to London. And now the crown took over as the dominant authority.
Something else that you're looking at here, Thomas, this conjunction, 1518, was at 4 degrees Capricorn. Go back to the previous one, 1284. They're still in Capricorn at late degrees of it. And now if we come to where we are today, notice how they keep occurring in Capricorn for a while. And now we come to 2020, and their conjunction was at 22 Capricorn. So each one of these epochs marks an historic turning point in the paradigm of government, if you will. And here we are now, and the big difference is the nuclear arsenal that is around the world. Because
ruled
for
by
the first
Pluto.
time, there's something like, I forget, I think there are 23,000 nuclear warheads scattered around the world. So all it takes is for one megalomaniac to activate a nuclear weapon, and that will bring us to a brink of human civilization in terms of our response to that provocation. And of course, this is something that could be imminent right now. It's already being threatened by the Russian leader. So gradually, what we're being pushed into by this Saturn-Pluto conjunction through this series of Capricorn synodic cycles is to look at how we govern. None of them are working anymore. Democracy is on its possible last legs in this country, but we see the rise of totalitarianism going on around the world in terms of government. But this is what we're looking at, sort of the last gasp of these old forms of government in preparation. We're having to evolve a new way of governing nations and the world as one entity, because that's what it is. And that's a paradigm that many people don't want to accept. We're better than this country, or our religion is better than that religion. Doesn't matter, because your behavior within those contexts affects everybody on the planet now. So we've still got ships stalled in Singapore, hundreds of ships that can't get supplies to these various distribution points, still all being affected by this COVID virus and the response to that. So it's impressing on us again and again and again, now, humanity, you'd better wake up here to how you're governing yourselves, because these things are not working.
Let's throw one other log on this fire, bringing it back to Kristen's question and where you took us with the answer to that question. Is Jupiter and Saturn conjoining? So again, the link to this is also in the show notes. But this book ended 2020. So we began the year with the Saturn-Pluto conjunction in Capricorn. We ended the year on December 21st with the last, most recent Jupiter-Saturn conjunction that took place at 0 degrees 29 minutes in Aquarius. So we are now operating under this Saturn-Jupiter synodic cycle.
Until the next Jupiter-Saturn conjunction,
which will be about 12 years.
Well, Jupiter in about 12 years will conjoin it again, because Saturn will have moved on. But look at what this one does, this synodic. This starts this whole, let's say next 12 years, just arbitrarily here. At 0, that's the very beginning of an Aquarian conjunction between these two planets. What does Aquarius rules? It rules humanity as a whole. It's a collective sign. It's the world. So look at what we're facing. Environmentally, people are having to migrate simply for food and water. Recent articles that I've read by geologists and earth scientists and so on are saying that in the next 50 years, much of the Earth, particularly in Africa, will be uninhabitable. That things are warming so much that the tropical or so-called temperate climates are moving further and further north. The Greenland ice cap is now melting. It's going to be inhabitable in 50 years. And there will be a shipping channel, I'm reading, that is going to be like the Northern Passage up above the Great Lakes and through Greenland, which is going to become a major port nation. Greenland, which was largely uninhabitable until recently. So this conjunction, again, is talking about the collectivity of humanity as a whole, the Aquarian symbolism. It's an air sign. It's not a sign about power on a tribal basis, which Capricorn is, opposite Cancer. My religious tribe, my political tribe, whatever. Very tribalistic. Capricorn can't, but this is Aquarius. This is all the people, not just some of the people. These things, these distinctions pale in the face of universal needs to survive. Aquarius also, incidentally, rules explosions. So these are the threats that we're having to work out. And all of the motives underlying these things: competition, capitalism. that too is dying and being reborn at the same time. But unrestrained capitalism, we know now what the effects of that are, unrestrained. So this conjunction is begging us to start thinking globally instead of nationally or just on a state-by-state level. Look at the Middle East with all these small, competing, religiously dominated sects of Islam killing each other. Look at Israel and Palestine. Those paradigms are no longer working.
Do you think we can do it?
Oh, I don't know. I'm not optimistic. And not that we won't survive. I think we will. But I'm not very optimistic.
We're too divided, aren't we?
Yeah.
Mars and Gemini, by the way.
Yeah.
Currently.
And we're not dealing with the real issues. So one of the, I think, call-outs for this Jupiter-Saturn conjunction in Aquarius, which rules technology, is to pay attention. It's an air sign. Pay attention to science and technology to help solve these problems. You're not going to find the solutions in 2,000-year-old Iron Age religions anymore. Those don't work anymore the way that they may have used to by uniting tribes and keeping the tribes reproducing themselves, because tribalism itself now has become suspect. And that's exactly what's dividing most of the countries on Earth, including the United States, tribalism.
Let me ask your thoughts on one other element of this that has come up in conversations, is especially with Pluto getting ready to move in there in the next, over the next couple of years, as it retrogrades back and forth over the cusp of Capricorn and Aquarius, finally moving into Aquarius. Authoritarianism is the shadow side of Aquarius. So right now we're under this Saturn-Jupiter influence that began in the fall or the last part of 2020. Over the next 18 months, we have Pluto moving in there. As you think about this, is perhaps this totalitarian or this authoritarian heavy hand through technology? We're talking about digital money. We're talking about health passports on our phones where you could be restricted both travel and money by social credits. These are all things that are being discussed now. Is that the reality in front of us under this kind of an aspect?
Oh, yeah, I think so. You know, Aquarius also rules revolutions. It rules technology. I don't know if you remember the Steven Spielberg film, Artificial Intelligence. In that film, at the end of it, the robot boy, played brilliantly by Joel Haley Osment, he encounters what appear to be aliens. He's been buried under the ocean for 2,000 years in the helipod, looking for the blue fairy, which he finds under the sea. And now he is brought to the surface by these beings that look like aliens, but they tell him, "You are the last of your kind." These aliens are actually what Earth people, what humanity has become in that distant future. And you watch what's happening, Thomas, with the gradual integration of technology and human bodies, pacemakers, cochlear implants. I just heard a woman just yesterday, a friend of mine, who's gotten a snap. She's lost her hearing in her left ear. Cochlear implants cost, she said, around $100,000. This thing is snapped. It's on the back of her head that she can clamp this little device to, and it turns her entire skull, the bones in the skull, into a speaker in her head. She takes it off, unsnaps it at night. So we have artificial limbs. We're beginning already as the human race to incorporate technology into flesh. And if you go into a book like, say, the Seth books, where he talks about civilizations where every participant in the collective is always aware of everybody else's thoughts and intentions and actions. We're there already to a degree. On our cell phones, we have news of events in our pockets instantaneously. But I can see an era where we as human beings, and as Seth says in these books, there isn't any crime in this area because we all know about it. If you have an intent to commit a crime, everybody knows about it. So it's not necessary. There's no point in doing it. and everything is collectively integrated and shared with each other. So this sounds very idealistic, but it's also very scientific, actually. So as we evolve as human beings, I think that that's probably where we're headed. It's really frightening to people now to think, my God, you telling me that the Secret Service can tell when I'm at Starbucks? Yes, they can.
That's already there.
Yeah, it's already there. So down the road, people are going to be able to tell when somebody is considering committing a crime before they do it. And that's where that is all part of the Aquarian age, so to speak. Gradually, we're becoming more collectively conscious and collectively aware. And we're already there. You look at environmentalists, they are. You look at people who communicate with animal species, they're already there. So it's exploring this world of how interconnected we all are with what we call nature, as opposed to trying to dominate nature or live apart from it. We're part of it.
That's an interesting point you just brought up of the morph into these things. You know, I experienced a change of my sun into a different solar arc sign about 5 years, 7 years ago, 6 years ago. And what I noticed was that that's not a hard and fast, as of December 31st, 2018, you are now a sun in Capricorn. No, it's a morph. And I could feel it because the time that I spent in Aspen were the last few years of Sagittarius giving way to a different type of mentality, a different way of thinking. But it doesn't happen overnight. Neither does this morph into the age of Aquarius that everybody's been talking about all of our lifetime, basically. It's a morph. These things take time to unfold.
Yeah, it's evolutionary. So it's silly, really, and childish to say, well, what day does that happen? That's nuts. What day did the dodo go extinct?
Or even what year? It's not over just a year.
Yeah, or even what year. So the question itself is a fallacy to begin with. It isn't on one day that suddenly everything changes. It's a gradual process. It's evolutionary. But we're absolutely being led toward this age of Aquarius, and this is one of those synodic conjunctions, thank you, Kristen, that points the way to this.
Well, and I was going to say, to wrap this up now, let's point people to how they can apply all of this to their own chart.
Well, one of the ways, for example, is one that I just mentioned. If you look in your chart, go back in the table, see what was the previous Jupiter-Saturn conjunction to your birth. You can get a lot of information from that. You can go back and look to see what was the last Saturn-Pluto conjunction. You could do this with any pair of planets. But Jupiter-Saturn is a particularly good one because those two planets are very much related to the world of work and business and profession and earning money and having a career and having stability and having government and having security and on and on and on. Those two planets are very comprehensive about those areas of life. So they really do point to civilization kinds of changes. Things like the invention of the printing press, Gutenberg's printing press, revolutionized everything. That happened to be under one of these earlier epochs that you were talking about. So you can look at and see where those prenatal synodic conjunctions occur and see what house they fall in your chart and begin to, when you think about them, get a lot of insight into what they meant for you personally, depending on what house they fall in. This one, for example, and you can look at just the transit when everybody can look at this Jupiter-Saturn conjunction at 0 degrees Aquarius. In my chart, it falls in the second house, or actually in the first, but near the second cusp. And this is very true for me. I'm doing nothing but astrology at this point in my life, whereas in the past, I was writing for television as well as teaching astrology and doing charts and so on. But no longer. It's all this. And thanks to you, we've started these podcasts at your invitation, and they've been very well received, and which is wonderful for me, wonderful for you, and good for astrology because it spreads the usefulness of this technique, this ancient technique, to understand yourself and to understand the world even.
So even this December 21st, 2020, last conjunction of Saturn and Jupiter is active wherever Aquarius is in your own chart.
Yes, and it also reminds me of something I'm not personally aware of, or haven't been. I have heard for years about this resurgence of astrology. Well, I've heard that every year of my life, starting in the 60s and late 60s with Linda Goodman's sun sign. Oh, this is going to revive astrology. Well, it did. But today, thanks to the internet, which is ruled by Aquarius, and that's really at the heart of all of this interconnectedness now of the whole planet. Aquarius is ruled by astrology is ruled by Aquarius. So this conjunction to me says that I don't know if acceptance is the right word, but the awareness of astrology's usefulness in a lot of different disciplines. Psychologists use it, doctors use it, bankers use it. They don't maybe talk about it. But I'll tell you, back in the 80s, I, among other places, was invited to speak at an after hours, they call it a seminar, for the Bank of Beverly Hills. And I thought, well, great. This will be a bunch of bank tellers in the conference room, and they wanted me to stay about an hour. Well, I got there early, of course, in the conference room. The first person to walk in the room was a male vice president with a stack of horoscopes and books under his arm. They had 30 people in that room. And they kept me 3 hours. And I thought, wow, for a bank to show this much interest. Now, that was back in the 80s. And of course, it was Los Angeles. So they tended to be a little more progressive. But I can see now, especially with the spread of these podcasts, not just ours, but everybody's on astrology, and just the interest in it, or growing interest around the world. I just read for some people in Bulgaria last week. So I'm reading for people all over the world who have this interest, and it's all through the internet, Zoom.
Technology.
Yes.
Wow, this has been fascinating. Thank you so much, Robert. Appreciate this, and for even wandering all the way back to 1284. I appreciate you taking that little trip with us. If you'd like to talk to Robert about this or other things in your own chart, check out the show notes. The links are in there, along with some other goodies that we have there of where you can find us on YouTube and in Discord. Kristen, thanks for the question. We'll see you guys next time on the Old Soul, New Soul Astrology Podcast with Robert Glasscock. Thank you so much for listening.